Have you ever experienced this? You are on the verge of achieving something important, a career milestone, a healthier lifestyle, or significant relationships, but suddenly inexplicably sabotage your own progress. Perhaps you procrastinated until after the deadline, picked a fight with your partner just when everything was going well, or gave up healthy habits just when they were starting to show results. This phenomenon is familiar to many successful people. For example, Stephen King in his memoirs describes how he nearly destroyed his career and family due to self-destructive behavior at the peak of his success. I have personal experience of such behavior. Several years ago, I decided to improve my health after a troubling visit to the doctor. For 3 months, I was consistent, regularly exercising, preparing nutritious meals, and ensuring proper sleep. The results were undeniable. Energy soared, mood improved, and lab tests showed significant progress. Friends began to notice and comment on the positive changes. A similar path was taken by actress Gwyneth Paltrow, who publicly shared her experience of derailing a healthy lifestyle just when she began to see serious results. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, I started making small exceptions in my routine. Just one missed workout turned into 3. Only once indulgences became daily indulgences. Despite clear evidence that new habits were improving my life in all measurable ways, I gradually gave up all of them, reverting to the same behavioral patterns that initially undermined my health. It was only months later that I realized this was not the first time I had sabotaged my well-being just when positive changes were beginning to take root. In the end, I was asking myself the same questions that many face. Why do I continue to sabotage myself? This pattern of self-sabotage is incredibly common, but rarely do we understand its deep psychological roots. Research shows that up to 77% of people regularly engage in self-sabotage in one form or another. Today we delve into the profound insights of Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists in history, who discovered that self-sabotage is not simply a matter of bad habits or weak willpower. Jung revealed that these self-destructive patterns stem from complex mechanisms of our unconscious mind, mechanisms that paradoxically believe they are protecting us. Modern neurobiological research confirms this theory, showing how specific brain regions associated with defense mechanisms are activated when we are on the brink of significant life changes. Before delving into Jung's ideas on self-sabotage, let's briefly introduce the man behind these revolutionary ideas. Carl Gustav Jung, born in Switzerland in 1875, started as a close collaborator of Sigmund Freud, but eventually parted ways to develop his own school of analytical psychology. While Freud focused primarily on repressed sexual desires, Jung dramatically expanded our understanding of the unconscious mind. His works had a profound influence on many prominent figures, including director Federico Fellini, who openly acknowledged Jung's theory's influence on his creativity. He distinguished the personal unconscious, containing our individual repressed experiences and forgotten memories, from what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer, common to all people, containing universal patterns and images that he called archetypes. Jung introduced concepts that deeply influenced not only psychology, but also literature, film, and even how we understand ourselves today. Terms such as introvert and extrovert, complex, and persona concept all originated from Jung. But perhaps his most significant contribution to understanding self-sabotage is the concept of the shadow, those parts of ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or never developed. As Jung famously said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you'll call it fate." Jung's structure offers a unique understanding of our self-destructive patterns precisely because he acknowledged the unconscious mind is not just a repository of repressed desires. It is an active, rational force with its own program, sometimes contradicting our conscious goals. This theory is supported by modern studies in neuropsychology, showing how subconscious processes can influence decision-making long before we become conscious of it. So what is self-sabotage from a Jungian psychology perspective? At its core, self-sabotage arises when unconscious forces within us actively work against our conscious intentions. It is not just failure or bad luck. It is a behavioral pattern where we undermine ourselves in predictable ways, often at critical moments. In modern life, this takes many forms, from procrastination, where we postpone important tasks despite understanding the consequences, to self-soothing with substances, food, or other distractions that provide temporary relief but long-term harm. A vivid example is the story of Robert Downey Jr., who nearly destroyed his early career with a drug addiction. The patterns are remarkably consistent. As things start to improve, as we are on the brink of growth or achievement, something inside us seems to pull the emergency brake. But here is the paradox that Jung acknowledged. Why would a part of us intentionally harm the very goals we consciously desire? Why do we constantly sabotage our own happiness, success, or well-being? Whitney Houston, for example, reached incredible heights in her career, only to engage in self-destructive behavior that ultimately led to a tragic end. The answer lies deeper than we might expect. Jung believed that the primary source of self-sabotage is what he called the shadow, the repository of all aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, suppressed, or never developed. From early childhood, we learn which parts of ourselves are acceptable to our family, culture, and society, and which should be hidden. Perhaps you learned that anger was not allowed in your home, or that certain talents or interests were not encouraged. Maybe vulnerability was met with rejection, and ambitions were considered selfish. Regardless of the specific content, we all develop what Jung called the persona, our social mask, showing the world only the acceptable parts of ourselves. But these rejected aspects do not simply disappear. They are pushed into the shadow, where they continue to exist and influence us from beneath the threshold of consciousness. Modern research in neurobiology confirms this theory, showing how repressed emotions and traumas can manifest through somatic symptoms and unconscious behavior. The key understanding is this: the shadow often contains not only negative qualities, but also our most vital and creative energies. When we reject parts of ourselves, we lose access to their potential positive manifestations. The connection between the shadow and self-sabotage is direct and powerful. When significant shadow material remains unrecognized, it tends to manifest in distorted, often destructive forms. For example, many creative individuals, including Van Gogh, suffered from self-destructive behavior precisely because they could not integrate their dark sides with their socially acceptable persona. For instance, if you have rejected your anger, you may find yourself passive-aggressive or mysteriously drained around certain people. If you have suppressed your ambitions, you may unconsciously undermine others' success, never pursuing your own. If you denied your need for connection, you may create drama in relationships just when genuine closeness becomes possible. In everyday life, we also project our shadow material onto others, seeing in them the very qualities we have rejected in ourselves. As Jung famously said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is especially apparent in public conflicts. Often the most vehement critics of a particular behavior later find themselves engaging in the same behavior. Closely related to the shadow is what modern Jungians might call the wounded inner child, those parts of us that carry unresolved pain from early experiences. Jung recognized that childhood wounds create what he called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of thoughts and feelings that can be activated in present situations. These complexes often form the core of our self-sabotaging patterns. Many successful people, such as Oprah Winfrey, have openly discussed how their childhood traumas influenced their adult behavior until they began to work with these aspects of their psyche. Consider what psychologists call repetition compulsion, our unconscious tendency to reenact painful situations from our past. From a Jungian perspective, this is not mere masochism. Rather, it is the psyche's attempt to master what once overwhelmed us, to finally resolve what remains unresolved. For example, Marilyn Monroe, who experienced numerous abandonment traumas in childhood, constantly recreated similar situations in her adult relationships. Parental complexes play a particularly powerful role here. If your father was overly critical, you may internalize an inner critic that sabotages your achievements. If your mother was emotionally unavailable, you may find yourself unable to accept care even when it is freely offered. What makes these patterns so enduring is that they initially developed as survival strategies. The child who learned to hide their true feelings to avoid rejection did what was necessary in that environment. The problem arises when these strategies continue to operate long after they are no longer needed, undermining what we now consciously desire. As Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." But this choice requires an awareness of how our past continues to shape our present. One of Jung's most revolutionary insights was his understanding of the psyche as a self-regulating system, naturally striving for wholeness and balance. From this perspective, self-sabotage is not just dysfunction. It often serves a teleological function, meaning it is goal-directed, even if that goal is not immediately apparent to our conscious mind. Modern studies in neuropsychology support this idea, showing how the brain automatically seeks homeostasis. When we experience self-sabotage, it may be the psyche's attempt to maintain psychological equilibrium. If one aspect of our personality becomes too dominant or rigid, another part may emerge to create balance. A workaholic may suddenly develop an irresistible urge to shirk responsibilities, not because they are lazy, but because their psyche craves a balance that their conscious mind denies. An example is the story of Steve Jobs, who at a certain point in his career was forced to leave Apple, which paradoxically led to his personal growth and subsequent triumphant return. Self-sabotage can also function as a defense against ego inflation. When we overly identify with success, achievements, or a particular self-image, the shadow may emerge to humble us, reminding us of our wholeness, which includes both light and shadow aspects. Sometimes self-sabotage forces us to integrate rejected parts of ourselves necessary for our growth. A person who has built their identity on being needed by others may sabotage their caretaking role, creating space to discover who they are beyond their caregiving function. Jung called this principle enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites, especially when taken to extremes. The more you suppress something essential, the more powerfully it eventually manifests. This understanding transforms how we view our self-undermining patterns. They're not just obstacles to overcome, but potentially significant messages from parts of ourselves seeking integration. At the heart of Jung's psychology lies the concept of individuation, a lifelong process of psychological development toward wholeness, integration, and self-realization. Self-sabotage, in its deepest sense, can be understood as resistance to this process of individuation. While we consciously desire growth, parts of us fear the required transformation. As Jung famously noted, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. This reveals a profound paradox. We may fear becoming who we truly are even more than we fear failure. True growth often requires letting go of familiar self-conceptions, relationship patterns, and defense mechanisms that, while limiting, provide a sense of security and identity. The ego, our conscious sense of self, naturally resists change, even positive change, because they represent a kind of psychological death of the old self. The more significant the potential growth, the stronger the resistance often becomes. This dynamic is well illustrated by the story of Mike Tyson, who, at the peak of his career, began self-destructive behavior, perhaps due to an unwillingness to embrace a new version of himself. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Our self-sabotage may actually reflect this terror, the fear of claiming our full potential and responsibility. As he observed, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. Nevertheless, Jung also noted that the privilege of life is to become who you truly are. This tension between our longing for authenticity and fear of transformation underlies many patterns of self-sabotage. Identifying your specific forms of self-sabotage is a crucial first step toward transformation. Jung believed that dreams provide a special window into the contents of the shadow. Pay attention to recurring dream themes, especially those involving chases, loss of something important, or unpreparedness. They often reflect unconscious conflicts around your goals. For example, the renowned director Federico Fellini kept detailed dream journals, which he later used not only for personal development, but also in his creative work. Another Jungian technique is active imagination, a form of directed fantasy where you engage in a dialogue with different aspects of yourself. Try to envision your sabotaging behavior as a character or entity with its voice and perspective. What would it say about its role in your life? What is it afraid will happen if it stops interfering? Signs of projecting shadow content include strong emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to situations, constant conflicts with the same types of people, or criticizing others for qualities you deny in yourself. Honest self-reflection is crucial. Ask yourself questions. What patterns have repeatedly shown up in your life? At what moment does everything usually go awry? Or were you taught to consider unacceptable in yourself as you grew up? Which aspects of others trigger strong reactions in you? Consider these prompts for a shadow work journal. When have I felt most ashamed, and what qualities did I express? What traits do I dislike most in others? Which aspects of myself do I try hardest to hide or control? What do I fear others would reject in me if they truly knew? When and how do I most predictably engage in self-sabotage? Jung's approach to overcoming self-sabotage was not about eliminating the shadow, but integrating it, developing conscious relationships with these rejected aspects of yourself. This marks a crucial difference between suppression and conscious containment. Suppression drives unwanted material deeper into the unconscious, where it gains strength and manifests in distorted forms. Conscious containment acknowledges these aspects, choosing how to express them constructively. Several practical techniques can help with shadow integration. Dream analysis involves recording and reflecting on dreams, looking for shadow figures and rejected aspects of yourself. Active imagination creates a dialogue with unconscious content through writing, art, or meditation. Symbolic understanding involves viewing your sabotaging behaviors as symbolic communications, not merely problems to be eliminated. Contemporary neuroscience has contributed to understanding these processes. Studies in neuroplasticity show how the brain can form new neural connections, supporting Jung's idea of integrating different personality aspects. Trauma specialists like Bessel van der Kolk emphasize the importance of working with the body and creative expression in the healing process, aligning with the Jungian approach to shadow integration. Jung emphasized developing ongoing relationships with the unconscious rather than attempting to resolve it once and for all. These relationships become a dialogue between the conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, that continues throughout life. Aggressive impulses once denied may become healthy assertiveness. Wildness once suppressed may become creativity. Vulnerability once defended may become authentic connection. Practices like Robert Johnson and Debbie Ford have developed accessible methods for working with shadow material in everyday life. While Jung developed his theories primarily through clinical observations and cross-cultural study of symbols, modern neuroscience has provided unexpected support for some of his insights. Implicit bias research, adaptive unconscious, and neuroplasticity align with Jung's understanding of unconscious processes and the potential for integration. There are numerous examples of people successfully integrating shadow material and transforming self-sabotaging patterns. For instance, the famous actor Robert Downey Jr. went from self-destruction to integrating his shadow, allowing him not only to restore his career, but also to reach new heights. These stories often follow a similar trajectory. Initial awareness of the pattern, acknowledgement of its origins, compassionate understanding of its defensive purpose, and gradual development of new satisfying ways that address underlying needs. The central principle in Jung's approach was what he called holding the tension of opposites, the ability to consciously experience conflicting aspects of yourself without trying to resolve the discomfort immediately. Jung believed that psychological growth requires embracing paradox, not seeking premature resolution. The ability to hold contradictions, to be simultaneously vulnerable and strong, ambitious and compassionate, independent and connected, marks mature development. From this tension arises what Jung called the transcendent function, a new psychological position that transcends the initial conflict. It is not a compromise or a middle path, but a genuinely new perspective that includes and transforms conflicting elements. Modern studies in neuroplasticity confirm this idea, showing how the brain can create new neural pathways that integrate previously conflicting thought patterns. This explains why quick fixes and simplified solutions do not address the root of self-sabotage. When we simply try to eliminate unwanted patterns without understanding their deeper purpose, they tend to resurface in other forms. Jung called us to see wisdom in resistance and gifts hidden in our struggles. The very patterns that cause us the most difficulty often contain vital energy and information necessary for our wholeness. Jung understood confronting the shadow as part of what he called the hero's journey, a universal pattern of psychological development found in all cultures and mythologies. In this journey, self-sabotage is not just an obstacle, but a necessary encounter with rejected parts of ourselves that must be integrated for true growth. The hero does not eliminate the shadow, but transforms it, incorporating its energy and wisdom into a more complete self. For example, the story of Nelson Mandela illustrates this process. He transformed his anger and pain into a force for positive change. This journey toward wholeness, which Jung called individuation, does not end in perfect harmony or the absence of inner conflict. Instead, it creates the capacity to contain and consciously relate to all aspects of yourself, making decisions based on both conscious values and unconscious wisdom. Psychological maturity in Jung's vision is not about perfection, but about integration, the ability to acknowledge our complexity, accept our contradictions, and act with an awareness of both our light and shadow. Reflecting on your own self-sabotaging patterns, it is important to approach them not just as problems to be solved, but as invitations to deeper self-awareness. Remember, this work requires courage. The courage to honestly look at yourself, to meet what you have denied, and to claim the fullness of who you are. As Jung wrote, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes.